Some words that come up a lot when discussing liberation movements such as that of Hawaiian, Palestinian, and First Nations people, and when discussing land reform in settler colonial states, specifically the idea of LandBack, are indigeneity and indigenous people. However, I find that the majority of us in the communist community, especially us who are not indigenous, don't specifically know what being an indigenous person means in the context of colonial, post-colonial, and settler colonial societies, as well as indigeneity's relationship with and differences with nativity and ethnicity in these contexts. So, in order to better understand indigenous liberation movements and thus better support our indigenous comrades, let's talk about 3 of these terms today in relation to indigenous liberation, settler colonialism, and land-back movements. Let's start by defining the first term, nativity. Nativity is simply a place of origin, but to be more specific to the topic at hand, we're going to use the definition of a native that applies to this discussion. A native is a person born in a specified place or associated with a place by birth or by ancestry, whether subsequently resident there or not. You can be native to a specific city, region, country, or continent. For example, a native Senegalese person, a native Scandinavian. The very definition of human nativity itself is not clean-cut, and there's a reason for that. It's purposely vague because biological anthropologists and sociologists are constantly asking themselves the same question. At what point do we start considering humans being native to certain places on Earth? When does citizenship and relocation begin to correlate with nativity, and when does it not? Are you a native Londoner just because you're born in London and so were your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents? Or are you a native Italian because your great-great-great-grandparents on both of your parents' side were born in Italy before moving to London? And if we wanted to go really far, us as Homo sapiens sapiens all originate from the same place 300,000 years ago in Africa. Does that mean you're not native to London or Italy and instead we're all native to Africa? The simple answer is this, kinda to all of those at different levels, residential, ancestral, and I guess human species. You can call yourself informally native to a city like London, despite your ancestors not having British descent, if your family has lived there for generations, or you yourself were born there. That's why people from different ancestral origins can call the same city home. That doesn't mean you're native to that city in the scientific sense, but your identity as a Londoner makes you native to that city. This is the same for Armenian Palestinians who are from Jerusalem. They have native ancestry to Armenia, but they are very much considered native to the city of Jerusalem, along with Palestinians who have ancestral ties to the land of Palestine. Another example is Galician people, because while their people's origins hail from the Gaels, similar to many Irish and Scottish people, there are still native people of Galicia, which is in the north of Spain and Portugal. And yes, as a species, us Homo sapiens sapiens originate from the continent of Africa. However, people who have lived outside of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years and have cultural ties to different lands outside of Africa don't really consider themselves African, even if their species is native to Africa, and don't have the same cultural ties to Africa as people who live in Africa or who are directly descended from people who have lived thousands and hundreds of thousands of years in Africa. For example, despite being displaced through enslavement by colonial powers for hundreds of years, many descendants of enslaved African people in the Americas still consider themselves native to Africa because of their cultural and historic ties to that continent. However, the relevant formal definition we are talking about in this context is not nativity based on residence or the entire human species. We're talking about nativity in the context of descending from a long line of people who have lived on a specific part of the planet recognized politically as a region, country, or even continent for a very long time and have historical and cultural ties to that land. For example, if someone informally asked me, "Where are you from?" outside of the context we are speaking of, I would say Cadiz, Spain, because I was born in and grew up there. However, within the context of nativity we are discussing, I wouldn't say I am from Cadiz in Spain because my dad is from Seville in Andalusia and Cavite in Luzon. My mom's family is from Vic in Catalonia. In the context I'm talking about, which is the one relevant to the context of indigeneity, I am native to the Iberian Peninsula and the Philippine archipelago. Now that we've established what I mean by nativity in this video, which seeks to compare and contrast it to indigeneity, let's move on to ethnicity, which is also relevant enough to be defined and understood in these discussions. An ethnic group or ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups, such as common sets of traditions, ancestry, language, history, society, culture, religion, or social treatment within their residing area. Sometimes ethnicity is used interchangeably with the word nation. An ethnicity or nation of people still has political connotation behind it and some semblance of nativity to some place, but it actually does not require a specific place of origin or state boundaries to exist. For example, Romani people are an ethnic people that live in multiple countries with no specific motherland they can point to despite originating in the northern Indian subcontinent. Romani people's sense of nativity varies greatly. Some consider themselves native to the country they live in, and some don't consider themselves specifically native to anywhere at all. Instead, they identify with a greater Romani nation that spans several continents and has no borders. Another example is Austronesian people, which is an ethnic group I'm a part of through the Tagalog subgroup. Austronesians reside and originate from Madagascar, Southeast Asia, Micronesia, and Taiwan, and don't particularly have a specific place of original nativity as an ethnic group, either because there is none or it just hasn't been determined, but speak Austronesian languages and share numeral systems, seafarer culture, and other traditional ways of life, such as similar or identical architecture, pottery, tattooing, music, dance, and religion, which makes them part of the same ethnicity. And ethnicity then does not have to correlate with where you live or where you consider yourself native to, as being ethnically from somewhere doesn't have to mean that you are natively from there. It depends on your own personal ethnic and native identities. In my case, for example, I consider myself native to the Iberian Peninsula and the Philippine Archipelago, and I consider myself ethnically Catalonian, Tagalog, Andalusian, and Sephardic. But some people in my family may consider themselves just ethnically Spanish and ethnically Filipino, or simply Iberian and Austronesian, which is a more simplified version of our overall ethnic makeup, depending on where they were born and what culture they feel more connected to. As you've probably noticed, the first two terms are debatable and malleable based on one's personal identity and personal experiences. However, that's not the case for the term indigenous. Indigenous is a political term referring to people native to a place that is settled or colonized. Indigeneity is a political identification of people that are currently and continually being dispossessed from their land. The difference between nativity and indigeneity is that every single person on this planet is native to somewhere, but not every single person on this planet is indigenous to somewhere. And the difference between indigeneity and ethnicity is that indigeneity is defined by political circumstance, and ethnicity is defined by cultural circumstance. Since indigenous is a political term, indigeneity cannot be separated from colonial politics, policies, and practices that have historically worked to reinforce the erasure of indigenous identities through assimilation, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing or genocide. Nativity and ethnicity exist despite colonialism. Indigeneity is a consequence of it. People native to a land that now encompasses the settler colonial state of the United States of America are indigenous people because they have been dispossessed of their land through colonization. But native people of France are not indigenous to France because their identity as French people does not stem from dispossession of their land by a foreign power that is currently oppressing them and settling on their land, but instead stems from the creation of a sovereign state established and led by people of native groups that encompass the land that is now the country of France. Additionally, the political meaning behind the word indigenous and its relationship to colonialism and settlerism also means that within a single country, there can exist native but not indigenous people and native indigenous people. Let me explain. This happens when a country led by native people of a country either expands its borders to include a region that includes an ethnic group of people that are now divided due to that border, or when one native group within the borders of a sovereign country begins to settle and dispossess other native ethnic groups of that country of their land and their sovereignty. The native people of Finland that are part of the Finnish ethnic group are native but not indigenous to Finland, because 93% of Finland is composed of Finnish people, and the overwhelming majority, if not everyone in their government, is too. And the majority of people who have sovereignty and control over Finland's land, are people of the Finnish ethnic group. But Sami people that are native to the Sampi region, which is now under the control of Norway, Finland, and Sweden, and therefore not under the control of native people of Sampi, are considered an indigenous group of Finland. This is because unless you are being dispossessed of your land and oppressed by a foreigner or another native to your country or land who is either dispossessing you on their own accord or are continuing the oppression started by the colonial powers before independence, you are not an indigenous person. I'm going to use myself as an example again. While I'm part of the native Tagalog ethnic group in the Philippines, I am not an indigenous person to the Philippines. The reason is because we were absorbed and assimilated by the colonial powers of Spain and the US by being forced to give up our religion and traditions by force in exchange for staying on our land and having higher standing in colonial society. Since the majority of our ethnic group fit neatly into the Spanish casta system by abandoning our indigenous identity in exchange for Catholicism and a higher standing in the racial pyramid of the Spanish colonies and later the American occupation, after independence, people of our ethnic group filled in the roles previously held by colonial and occupational powers and resumed the oppression and dispossession of indigenous groups in the Philippines who descend from those who refused to give up their religion and traditions and therefore were forced off of or were continually at war with the colonial powers over their land. The Filipino government to this day, despite being run by native Filipinos, and Filipino society today are still heavily influenced by their former colonial powers and even have strong ties with one of its former colonial powers, the United States. The majority of the people of my ethnic group and other non-indigenous native ethnic groups in the Philippines still hold the same colonial attitudes towards the indigenous peoples in the Philippines who refused and continue to reject assimilation to Catholic hegemony and the highly Hispanicized and Americanized society of the Philippines. As a result of this, indigenous peoples like the Lumad of Mindanao are still living under colonial terror 75 years after the state of the Philippines was declared independent. In fact, the current government of the Philippines under Duterte has been the deadliest for indigenous people since independence. Lumad people are still being forced out of and dispossessed of their land by land grabbing or militarization, all of which the Filipino government supports, ignores, or directly funds. Mining, logging, and energy companies owned both by foreigners and by native Filipino bourgeois are forcing them out of their ancestral homes. And the Lumad people are especially vulnerable to oppression and violence by the armed forces of the Philippines, who are militarizing their territories and detaining their community leaders and teachers in suspicion of being associated with the New People's Army, which is actively on Mindanao. Since they are often caught in the crossfire between the New People's Army and the armed forces of the Philippines, the Lumad people's education, property, and security are endangered by this violence, and the Lumad are constant targets of red tagging. Red tagging, by the way, is Filipino McCarthyism. A very recent example of the continuation of the colonial dehumanization and terror against Lumad people by the Filipino government is the case of the Lumad 26. In a school in Cebu on February 15th, 2021, 22 students, 2 teachers, and 2 tribe leaders were arrested without a warrant, and they were taken into custody by members of the Philippine National Police. This one example of anti-Indigenous violence is just a continuation of President Rodrigo Duterte's policies, as he previously threatened to shut down or destroy NGO-funded community schools and continues to do so after the detention of the LUMAD 26, because he claims that these schools run by non-governmental organizations are radicalizing LUMAD people to join the New People's Army. Not the material conditions that the LUMAD people have to deal with day after day for being Indigenous people, and the exploitation of their native land and the dispossession of their native land. No, that's not what's radicalizing Indigenous people to join the New People's Army, which specifically sets out to end those forms of exploitation. No, it must be the non-governmental organizations that are radicalizing these communists. You have to laugh at Duterte in order to not cry about him. Moving on, of course, I have to add that this is all on top of the terrorization of the LUMAD people by their former colonizer and occupier, who still holds imperial power over the Philippines, the United States. There's frankly too many examples to reference, and way more recent ones at that, but I'll give you one I learned about 2 weeks ago that shook me to my core. In a brutal display of imperialist violence and psychological warfare in the 1950s, the CIA captured communists in the Philippines and hung and drained them of blood, throwing their remains onto trails in a way that made it look like they were attacked by an aswang, which is an evil creature in Indigenous Filipino folklore, to intimidate Indigenous people in the provinces of Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, and Tarlac, who believed in the aswang, so they would stop supporting and aiding the communists who were fighting for them. This act of extreme cruelty and violence terrified the Indigenous people into submission to their former colonial powers' interests. Going back to discussing indigeneity as a whole, not only can you be native to land, but not indigenous to it. The definition of who is indigenous can change based on political and historic circumstances. This means that native people who were once indigenous at some point in history may not be indigenous anymore, and native people today may be indigenous in the future if the political circumstances necessary for the emergence of indigeneity, which is of course colonialism, takes place against them. At the beginning of the colonization of the Philippine archipelago, all 182 Filipino ethnic groups were indigenous. Now, after independence, only 40 are, because only 40 groups in the Philippines are being oppressed based on the non-conformity of their native identity to Filipino society and the dispossession of their land by the Filipino government. And during the period of the Caliphate of Cordoba, another example, Iberians, regardless of whether they were Christian or Jewish or Muslim Iberians, were indigenous because they were under the control of an oppressive colonial foreign power who took control over their land and led their state for half a millennia. I know the Al-Andalus enjoyers are going to comment that Al-Andalus was not that bad, and they actually provided a lot of rights and blah 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 for ethnic minorities and the indigenous. I know, as someone who studies Al-Andalusian history, because I find it very, very fascinating, even though it was not as bad as what the European powers did when it came to colonization, at all, not even comparable, still colonization, bro. I can make a video discussing Al-Andalus, discussing the Jewish Golden Age and all these things, because really awesome things happened during Al-Andalus, and obviously Al-Andalus was a much better occupational power in Iberia than the Visigoths were or the Romans were, because they didn't really partake in genocide as much. Well, there were still pogroms against Jewish people and such, but it wasn't state sanctioned as much until the Almoravids came. And in Visigothic Spain and Roman Spain, it was public policy. Yes, all of those things. Still colonization. Still colonization. But anyways, discussion for another day. I'm gonna stop being distracted and explain what this has to do with indigeneity. But after the Reconquista, native Iberian Christian king Isabella and Ferdinand took control of most of the peninsula and established a Catholic kingdom in which only Christian Iberians were considered citizens in, taking the mantle of the dispossessor and oppressor when they massed, expulsed, persecuted, and massacred Jewish and Muslim Iberians, Sephardim, and Moriscos through a state-sponsored wave of terror known as the Inquisition, forcing those indigenous Sephardim and Moriscos to either flee their homes, convert to Catholicism, or face summary execution for refusing to leave their land and their religion. A land once under the control of a settler caliphate that favored its Muslim citizens, including the native Muslim citizens, and oppressed and discriminated against its non-Muslim citizens, then became a land under the control of a Christian kingdom ruled by a native monarchy that oppressed and persecuted other native people that were not Christian, debatably much worse, not debatably actually, 100% much worse than the settler government did, maintaining the indigenous status of those Iberians of non-Christian religions, while native Iberian Christians lost their indigeneity through their higher status under the new Christian fanaticist government run by native people. I'm going to add 2 side notes before we continue to talk about indigeneity, nativity, and ethnicity's relationship to LandBack movement and what indigenous liberation movements are and what they are not. The first thing I'm going to add is that what I just explained pertaining the Philippines after independence and Spain after the Reconquista are exactly why both the independence of the Philippines from the United States and Spain's Reconquista are not examples of decolonization, because native people in power after independence wasted no time in continuing the oppression and dispossession of other native people, making themselves the oppressive native force, maintaining a colonial system, and the others, the indigenous people, who are suffering still due to continued colonialism to this day. Secondly, and most importantly, this is the definition of indigeneity in the colonial context in its relation to nativity and land dispossession. It is the political definition of indigeneity in relation to racial and ethnic hierarchy in sovereign, post-colonial, and settler colonial states. It does not mean that people with indigenous ancestry that are not considered indigenous by this definition due to political circumstance, for example, Latina people and Filipino people with heavy indigenous ancestry who have been detribalized and forcibly assimilated into colonial culture, cannot reconnect and reclaim their indigeneity. Let's remember that every single state virtually in the Americas is a settler colonial state. What does this mean for indigeneity? This means that in settler colonial contexts, as opposed to post-colonial like the Philippines, which is run by native Filipinos, in the settler colonial context, the majority of the power is in settler hands, and the majority of society shows socioeconomic differences and power differences along racial lines, with indigenous people and, in many cases, descendants of enslaved people at the very bottom. And this is actually crucial and essential for the settler colonial state to continue existing. As you know, in these colonies, there was a racial system in which indigenous people were at the bottom, white people were at the top, enslaved African people were at the bottom, and in the middle of the colonizer and the indigenous people and the enslaved people, there was a category of people who had mixed European and African or indigenous descent. Many of these mixed descents were not by choice of the indigenous or African people. If not all of them were not by choice. It was a coercion, a forced assimilation, a sexual crime. And the colonizers knew this and did it anyway because they knew that the majority of the people in their settler state were indigenous or were of enslaved African descent or both. And so if these people wanted to rebel, they very well could, and they could overthrow the settlers very easily. So in a way, these identities, which I'm not going to name because I don't like the terms, and a lot of them are used as slurs and have very ugly connotations and meanings in Spanish, so I'm not going to say them. These terms are white supremacist terms, specifically put in place in order to erase Indigenous identity into obscurity, because again, settler colonial states can only exist through the continued genocide and ethnic cleansing and dispossession of Indigenous land. So unlike indigeneity in non-settler colonial countries like Finland and like the Philippines, there are no native but not indigenous people of settler colonial states. There are only indigenous people, people who were forcibly displaced, like enslaved African people and refugees, not even to mention the overwhelming amount of Afro-Indigenous people there are in Latin America, like the Garifuna, like the Taino people. There's a lot of Afro-Taino people and settlers. Thus, in the settler colonial context, it's actually important to reject the idea that you can be native but not indigenous, and reclaim your indigeneity to reject settlerism, to reject white supremacy. But here are some indigenous creators to follow who know more about the politics and do's and don'ts of reconnecting with your indigenous identity. And here are a couple TikToks that specifically talk about this.
Okay, we have Taino ancestry. Okay, 95% of people have some Taino ancestry according to you. How much Taino ancestry though? How much African ancestry that we have? And right, so we have mostly African ancestry. Why are you going so hard over the ancestry that we have the least?
So I'm going to explain to you why this whole argument is really problematic. I understand that your account has a specific agenda, and as a Dominican, I get your sentiment, and I haven't always agreed with everything that you've said because you do say some really dismissive things at times. But this is one of those things that really rubbed me the wrong way, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, looking at percentages is blood quantum, okay? So let's talk about blood quantum, because this is something that you yourself are pushing with your rhetoric and you don't even know that you're doing it. And I get that you're trying to uplift our African side, but you are using colonial thinking to erase our native ancestry. So go ahead and pause and read. Blood quantum was created by white people, okay, by the United States government to measure the percentages of purity in our blood, to basically tell Native Americans and their culture within their tribes who can and cannot be native based on blood quantum. So for example, if someone from one tribe falls in love with someone from the other tribe, their blood quantum goes down even if that other person is native, because they will no longer be considered a high enough percentage for their own tribe. It is literally weighing their indigenous identity and culture based on percentages. And that is what you're pushing right now. Now that you understand what blood quantum is, let me remind you that the Caribbean islands are indigenous lands. They're part of the Americas. The Tainos are native to the Americas, which means us as descendants, we are native to the Americas. We are indigenous to the Americas. Indigenous means that you originate naturally from that place. Our first root where we originate from as Dominicans is indigenous. It's from Tainos. You literally cannot sit here on this app and try to negate our native ancestry with colonial thinking. You also forget that because Columbus came on indigenous lands and did what he did, our ancestors have been through so much generational trauma in the islands that our grandparents are afraid to identify as indigenous because it was beaten out by the government. We rep our Taino ancestry because we are in part indigenous, because we come from and are born from indigenous lands, because our culture is still present in the islands. By saying that us claiming our indigenous side is a form of anti-blackness is pushing the erasure that Columbus tried to do.
I've been thinking a lot about mestizaje and like how we delineate like this difference between like mestizos and like indigenous people, and we usually do that to like analyze like privileges among like mestizos for like having white blood and thus like have a higher like socioeconomic status in like Latin America. But I realized that like when we do this, when we delineate this difference between mestizos and indigenous people, we are doing settler colonialism's work. Like we're just perpetuating cultural genocide because we are buying into this race realist idea that like somehow you having white blood and being mixed race makes you no longer indigenous. And that was the whole purpose of mestizaje. It was meant to just like culturally genocide like indigenous people in the Americas. Like, it was just meant to just be like, oh, like, you're not indigenous anymore, you have white blood, therefore you're different. And like, when we continually try to make this difference, it just perpetuates everything.
If this were to be a simple yes or no answer with nothing else after it, the answer is no, it's not wrong to claim something and not be culturally affiliated with it, even though it's running in your blood. Adding context into it is it can be harmful in many ways that a lot of reconnecting natives or detribalized natives don't see yet. It's all about self-awareness and understanding that our experiences are different, even though we all fall under the umbrella term Indigenous. For example, if you're someone who's detribalized, if you're someone who is reconnecting, someone who is reconnected, and someone who has always been connected, those all have completely different experiences, even though they're all Indigenous. So when people say, be careful when and who you claim because it could be harmful, we mean that. We don't need you to take it personally. We're not saying your struggles don't matter. We're not saying you're not native. We are literally saying just be careful, be as educated as possible in your journey, because, unfortunately, some people will be stepping on toes, will make mistakes. That's inevitable. But in order to step on as few toes as possible in your reconnecting journey, or even as a detribalized person, you need to have some level of self-awareness in where you stand in relation to other people. But that doesn't mean you're not Indigenous. It doesn't erase your history or the blood that makes you up. So when it comes to people who are claiming to be Indigenous and have no cultural affiliation, despite it being in their blood, the answer isn't that it is harmful for you to claim your indigeneity. The answer is that it can be. There's a chance that it might be, depending on how you maneuver that Indigenous identity. Because there are so many people who are reconnecting, that are speaking over connected people. There are so many people who are detribalized, that are speaking over reconnecting people or connected people. That's when the water starts to get muddy, when people start to speak for other groups who have different experiences, even though we're all under the same umbrella. And another part of this reconnecting journey requires self-reflection. Now that you have this newfound Indigenous identity, what are you going to do with it? Are you just going to simply claim it and not know anything? Are you going to try to learn something? Are you going to try to connect, learn the culture, the language? Can you even do that? What does that conversation look like? Just with yourself. The reason why I personally find that important for reconnecting and detribalized people is because that sets y'all apart from the people who are like, I'm 46% Native American to Mexico. I'm definitely Aztec, and does nothing else other than that.
You didn't come at me with grace, but I'm going to extend it to you. End quote what somebody said in the comment, because quite frankly, it was perfect. Do not discriminate against those who are forcefully disconnected, detribalized, and assimilated. I would think that somebody who is Indigenous would understand this. My tribe, the Chappaquiddick Wampanoag, are not federally recognized. We're also known as people of the first light, and we are indigenous to the island of Chappaquiddick, also known as Noape before colonization, meaning land amid the waters or streams. We were also a tribe of first contact, which means that we were dealing with the settlers in North America before any other tribes. We got the proverbial short end of the stick when dealing with the US government and federal recognition. And a note on that, federal recognition is the US government choosing to recognize you as a tribe. Do you really place the most value in your oppressor recognizing you and others as a tribe?
Just to recap the definitions before we delve into any further discussions, in the context of colonialism, political structures, and dispossession, Native people are people born in a specified place or associated with a place by birth or by ancestry, whether subsequently resident there or not. Except in the case of settler colonialism, there can be Native people to a country that are not Indigenous to a country. An ethnicity or nation are a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups, whether or not they share nativity to a specified place. And Indigenous people are a political identification of Native people that are currently and continually being dispossessed from their land, either by a colonizer or settler, or in some cases, a native force that is upholding a past colonial structure. Let's also acknowledge that just like indigenous people are a specific type of native people, there are other different types of indigenous people. This isn't too complicated to understand. It's just that some indigenous people identify with different terms that mean indigenous. Aboriginal is one of these, which means inhabiting or existing in a land from the earliest times or from before the arrival of colonists. First Nations is another, which refers to any of the groups of Indigenous peoples of Canada officially recognized as an administrative unit by the federal government or functioning as such without official status. Okay, we finally have all our definitions down 35 minutes later. So now, let's talk about LandBack. LandBack is an indigenous movement, not simply a native one. It is an indigenous movement which seeks to give the political and economic control over the land that had historically belonged to indigenous people prior to colonization back to those indigenous hands. The phrase was coined by Arnell Tailfeathers of the Kainai Nation in 2018 and is now a rallying cry and a basic demand of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island and around the world, from water protectors and land defenders in North America to the Hawaiian decolonization movement to the Palestinian liberation movement. I say it's an indigenous movement, not simply a native one, because we are already seeing native but not indigenous people appropriating the term. We're also seeing settlers appropriate the term. So, anyways, everyone who calls themselves a communist should support LandBack. It is not only an essential part of decolonization, and we should be allied to decolonization, but it is quite literally the kind of land reform that truly applies to the material conditions of states with indigenous people within their borders, whether they be settler, colonial, or not. The Sandinista government of Nicaragua is doing a great job at supporting LandBack, by the way, if you want a real-life example. They just declared another indigenous autonomous region, making it the third area in Nicaragua under the complete sovereignty of the people indigenous to said land. That's why the government of Nicaragua has heavily indigenous Nicaraguan support. That and because they're doing a lot of other amazing things for their peoples. There's a reason why FSLN has such popular support in Nicaragua. It's because they're doing great. And finally, let's talk about settler colonialism, because it is very relevant to indigenous liberation movements around the world. As you probably noticed from the previous examples I gave, indigenous people live in sovereign countries and in neo-colonial countries, in semi-colonial countries, as well as settler colonial countries. But the conditions of settler colonialism and their relationship to indigeneity and nativity and settlerism are slightly different and important for American communists specifically to understand, because the entirety of the Americas are comprised of settler colonial states. Some of them are decolonizing settler colonial states, but still, I'm going to quote global social theory's definition of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. Settler colonialism can be distinguished from other forms of colonialism by a number of key features. First, settler colonizers come to stay. Settler collectives intend to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. Second, settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event. Settler colonialism persists in the ongoing elimination of indigenous populations and the assertion of state sovereignty and judicial control over the lands. Settler colonial societies do not stop being colonial when the political allegiance of the founding metropole or mother country, like Britain was to the 13 colonies, is severed. Third, settler colonialism seeks the end of colonial difference in the form of a supreme and unchallenged settler state and people. They attempt to eliminate the challenges posed to settler sovereignty by indigenous peoples' claims to land by eliminating indigenous peoples themselves and asserting false narratives and structures of settler belonging. Settler colonial societies around the globe tend to rely on remarkably similar spatial constructs, power structures, and social narratives. Beginning with terra nullius, the perception that lands with long-term use by indigenous peoples are empty or unused. settler colonialism proceeds to carve up indigenous held land into discrete packets of private property. As settler collectives invest their identity and material belongings into these properties, they simultaneously create or empower a state to defend these properties from indigenous peoples and nations who are seen as inherently threatening. The power of settler state structures is often embodied in the form of frontier police forces. These forces often wielded or continue to wield extraordinary power over indigenous people, including the ability to apprehend children, to prevent people from leaving official reserve lands, or conversely, to expel individuals or families from reserved territories, to control employment, and even summarily direct police or military forces against indigenous people. These extreme powers are exercised based on careful constructed racist narratives. Indigenous people are considered to be quote-unquote savage. Men often portrayed as violent. Women are hypersexualized and both in need of care from the quote-unquote civilized settler state. The narrative dehumanization of indigenous people supports parallel narratives of a peaceful, adventurous, and virtuous settlement and expansion, as quote-unquote brave pioneers are held up as paragons of new settler nations carved out of frontier spaces. Let me state again that though indigenous people don't only reside in settler colonial states and aren't only oppressed by non-native people, in settler colonial states, the relationship between the settlers and the indigenous people is always that of colonizer and colonized. The settler is the oppressor, is the person directly responsible for the continual dispossession of indigenous land, and is what needs to be revolted against to decolonize the indigenous land and return it to indigenous hand. The goal of settler colonialism is to establish a supreme and unchallenged settler state. These states can only exist through the continued elimination of indigenous populations through genocide, ethnic cleansing, assimilation, or expulsion, and thus settler colonial societies never stop being colonial until they are destroyed through decolonization. Oppression against indigenous people can only be ended by decolonization and indigenous liberation, no matter where indigenous people live. Settler colonial states today include the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, the rest of the Americas, minus some decolonizing settler states like Bolivia and Nicaragua. Other settler colonial states outside of the Americas include Australia, Israel, New Zealand, and Taiwan. Just to elaborate what I mean by a decolonizing settler state, as defined by the Decolonial Atlas, a decolonizing settler state are settler states that have to some degree taken back political control from its settlers. They include South Africa, Liberia, Bolivia, Nicaragua, debatably Cuba, and Zimbabwe. And there's also territories that are governed by settlers but aren't exactly considered settler colonial states because they're not states, they're territories. But the same analysis of settler colonialism can be applied to these territories. Some examples of these territories include Northern Ireland and French Guiana. Another thing that settler states or territories, decolonizing or not, have in common, which I previously mentioned briefly, is that there is a racial hierarchy in which indigenous people, and in many cases descendants of forcibly enslaved African people, are at the bottom and the settlers are at the top. In the majority of the settler states, the settlers in question are predominantly white, so the structure of racial hierarchy is that of white supremacy. There are, of course, exceptions, like Taiwan, whose settlers are not white, they're Chinese, more specifically from the Han ethnic group. The government of Taiwan, backed by the United States, has truly perpetuated such heinous and atrocious acts of violence against the Aboriginal people of Taiwan, people who are part of the Austronesian ethnic group. Another example is obviously Israel. Half of their settler population are non-white Jews from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And before someone comments this, yes, non-white Israeli settlers are not treated as equals to white Israelis, even though it's obvious that the oppression they experience is barely comparable to the brutal treatment that Palestinians receive at the hands of Israel. Much like how Asian Americans living in the United States are still victims of Orientalism and xenophobic hate crimes, and horrifically violent ones at that, but they're still upheld in the American white supremacist structure as the quote-unquote model minority myth to further justify the settler state's violence and anti-blackness and anti-indigenous sentiment. The point is, just like as much racism as there is against Asian people in the United States, it is not comparable to anti-blackness or anti-indigenous sentiment in the United States, and you can clearly see that by the anti-blackness in Asian communities. Non-white Israelis are very often anti-Palestinian and racist against Palestinians, and they're still upholding and settling in a settler colonial state that has a racial hierarchy that is based on white supremacy and is colonialism. So again, the people that are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy of settler colonial states are the indigenous people. There are people in the middle, but they are not at the bottom. So regardless of what race the settlers are, there's a racial hierarchy that places the indigenous people alongside, again, descendants of enslaved people in a lot of cases, and also in a lot of cases, people who are both descendants of enslaved people and indigenous people. At the bottom, receiving the most violence and the most marginalization and discrimination from the state, whose very existence relies on their ethnic cleansing and dispossession of their land. Settler colonial states are inherently racist and inherently genocidal. While in the sovereign and in the semi-colonial states, decolonization can mean reconciliation and sovereignty between the native people, inhabitants of that state, and rejection of past colonial attitudes, there is no reconciling the colonizer to the colonized, the settler whose entire state is dripping in indigenous blood. The way to decolonize a settler colonial state is through armed indigenous liberation struggle and revolution. On Violence chapter of Wretched Earth by Frantz Fanon style, because that, and only that, is how justice and liberation are achieved. Alright, so we're done with definitions. And now we're going to talk about indigenous liberation. So now that we know what indigeneity is, what settler colonialism is, what LandBack is, we're going to talk about what is and isn't an indigenous movement. Since many colonial and non-indigenous groups are trying to co-opt the language of decolonization either to further harm indigenous peoples and because also well-meaning people accidentally confuse the two, let's discuss what is or isn't an indigenous liberation movement by citing a couple of clean-cut examples of each. First and foremost, the American Indian movement was and is quite obviously a perfect example of an indigenous liberation movement. Those leading the American Indian movement are indigenous people who are fighting against settler colonialism and for land back, as well as rallying against the oppression of indigenous people whose land was stolen and occupied by settlers and is now recognized as part of the United States of America. They address systemic issues of poverty, discrimination, and police brutality against indigenous people in the United States, as well as protest the violation of treaty rights, unemployment, and lack of education in indigenous communities, etc. And in general, all liberation movements led by indigenous groups whose land was stolen by the United States are obviously indigenous liberation movements like water protectors and such. Taiwanese independence is not an indigenous movement. I saw some right-wingers on Twitter claim that any leftist who supports land back but isn't supportive of Taiwanese nationalists is apparently against indigenous people. Just to be clear, the KMT led by Chiang Kai-shek, who colonized the island after Japan surrendered it and led a white terror campaign that resulted in the death and disappearance of over 30,000 indigenous Taiwanese intellectuals, activists, and people suspected of opposition of the KMT. That's what they identify as an indigenous movement. And just to be clear, the Democratic Progressive Nationalist Party, which is the party actually in power in Taiwan right now, is not any better. Like Biden, they said, quote-unquote, sorry for settler colonialism and then continued to be a colonizer. Progressive colonization is still colonization. Taiwan is a settler colonial state. Saying Taiwanese independence is an indigenous movement is like saying that George Washington was an indigenous liberation leader. You should not be supporting the Taiwanese government if you support indigenous people, and you should be recognizing that Taiwanese people, indigenous people of Taiwan, deserve sovereignty over their land, not to be controlled by either Chinese colonization in the form of the Taiwanese government, and obviously not the Japanese or the United States either. A colonizer is a colonizer. An American colonizer is a colonizer. A Japanese colonizer is a colonizer. A Chinese colonizer is a colonizer. Taiwan is a settler colonial state. Meanwhile, in contrast, the Hawaiian independence movement is an indigenous liberation movement because Hawaii is a colony, and the people leading the independence movement are the colonized indigenous people of the islands of Hawaii. When looking at an independence or nationalist movement around the world, you have to consider who is leading the movement, what their politics are, and why they're leading this movement. Hawaiian nationalism is a nationalism of indigenous liberation and sovereignty that is constantly and violently repressed by the settler colonial state that is exploiting their land and dispossessing the indigenous people from it. Taiwanese nationalism, in contrast, is a settler colonial nationalism backed by that same settler colonial state that is colonizing Hawaii. Palestinian liberation is unequivocally and non-negotiably an indigenous liberation movement. Palestinians are being dispossessed of their land that they have lived on for millennia. The occupation and annexation of Palestinian land is happening at the hands of a settler state whose existence and expansion is reliant on the genocide and expulsion of indigenous Palestinian people. This occupational government would not exist without catastrophic atrocities like the Nabka. Palestinians, like all indigenous people in settler colonial states, face horrifying repression by the colonizing force who is taking their land, and like all colonizers, this violence and brutality is justified through anti-indigenous racist accusations of savagery and the need for a colonial and racial superior people to quote-unquote save Palestinians from themselves. This involves pinkwashing and involves painting Palestinian men to be evil savages that everyone should fear. Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, in refugee camps outside of Palestine, and Palestinian citizens of Israel are constantly and continually exposed to settler violence and displacement, which is supported and even mandated by the State of Israel. Palestinian liberation is an indigenous liberation movement. And in addition to what I just said, because again, settlers are trying to co-opt the language of indigenous liberation to support settler colonialism, let me emphasize and explain that Zionism is not an indigenous liberation ideology or movement, and it never has been. Zionism, like Taiwanese nationalism, is backed by every single settler colonial state in the entire world. Not only that, but Zionist colonization has way more in common with the American colonization society that created the state of Liberia than any indigenous movement around the world. Unlike indigenous Palestinians, Zionist settlers burn and destroy the land they settle on. They're the ones dispossessing native people from their land, and they have the monopoly on violence that they use to repress and eliminate any dissent, even if the dissenter is 8 years old. As you can remember from the definition of this political term, indigenous people do not ever have the monopoly on violence or ever have support from settlers around the world. Indigenous liberation is diametrically opposed to settler colonialism and not funded by it. While Palestinian liberation from the beginning calls for Palestinian sovereignty over their own land, and they identify people indigenous to Palestine as Palestinian, the Zionist movement did not from the get-go decide on colonizing Palestine due to a supposed right to that land, and in fact debated colonizing Uganda and indigenous land in Argentina. The most important thing to point out to Zionists trying to co-opt the language of decolonization to support colonialism, and this is how ethnicity comes into play in discussions of indigeneity, is that the Israeli state does not define who is allowed to call themselves Israeli based on indigeneity or nativity to the land. They offer Israeli citizenship based on their Jewish ethnicity. So for those who do not know, when someone converts to Judaism, regardless of where they are native from, they become part of the Jewish nation, making them ethnically Jewish. That's because Judaism is an ethno-religious group, not a regionally based ethnic group. When I am done with my conversion or reversion to Judaism, I'm going to be considered ethnically Jewish. As discussed before, that's not something weird. Many people around the world, like Austronesian people, have ancestry to completely different places, but consider themselves part of the same ethnic group. So the reason this disproves that Zionism is an indigenous movement is because if Zionism cared about indigeneity instead of ethno-nationalism, they wouldn't be handing out citizenship to South African Afrikaner white settlers who convert to Judaism. And they wouldn't be offering them to Spaniards like me who have one ancestor in their family with a convertible last name at the same time that they're making all Palestinians, including Palestinian Jews who are against colonization, refugees by forced displacement. They are not an indigenous liberation movement, they are an ethno-nationalist movement. All of this already disproves Zionism as an indigenous liberation movement, without even mentioning that the majority of the land that these supposed decolonized Judeans, aka ethno-nationalists, are occupying is not Judea. And even under the assumption that every single settler on Palestinian land is somehow quote-unquote indigenous Levantine, because they haven't decided what they're indigenous to yet, by the way, unlike every single indigenous person who knows exactly who they are. And either way, the majority of the settlers are not indigenous Levantine people, but even if every single settler was supposedly indigenous Levantine, so is every Palestinian by that definition. Palestinians are indigenous to the land of Palestine and the Levant. In fact, every Levantine is native to the Levant. If your movement was an indigenous Levantine LandBack movement, you wouldn't be forcibly displacing Levantines from their land. Let me say this again, Zionism is not an indigenous liberation movement. It is a settler colonial ethno-nationalist one that is displacing and ethnically cleansing indigenous Palestinians from their ancestral lands, just like the United States does against Aboriginal Hawaiians and the Lakota and all other indigenous people to Turtle Island, just like the American Colonization Society did against the indigenous peoples of the land that the settler colonial state of Liberia was formed on, just like white Afrikaners did against indigenous South African people, just like the Australian government continues to do against the Aboriginal people of the continent, just like Canada does against the First Nations people to this day, just like every single settler colonial state in existence. Every single contradictory argument that Zionists make to justify the murder and displacement of Palestinians falls flat on its face as soon as you dedicate 5 minutes of your time to learning the history and the origins of the annexation and occupation of Palestinian land. And that is because Zionism is settler colonialism. It was defined as a colonial project by the founders of Zionism and is at its core a racist, anti-Palestinian, and anti-indigenous ideology, because this project can only survive through the ethnic cleansing and displacement of indigenous Palestinian people. Needless to say, this is a perfect example of something that is not an indigenous movement. Okay, to finish off this incredibly long video that I made just because Twitter discourse has been hurting my brain these past few months, you may be asking if all indigenous movements are as identifiable and non-negotiable as that of Palestine, Hawaii, the Lumad people, and the American Indian movement. Is there some movements that we don't know if we should identify as indigenous or not? The answer is, yeah, there is. Since indigeneity is a political term, there's still debate about whether some movements around the world constitute as indigenous liberation movements or just separatist or independence movements. Of course, these movements being separatist or independent doesn't mean that they're any less important than indigenous liberation movements, but they do mean that they're just simply not indigenous movements by the definition of what indigenous is. I'll give you some examples of debated ones and my own personal opinion based on what I know about indigeneity, which of course you can disagree with because it's entirely debatable. Let me emphasize, you can debate with me on these, not on the ones that we just covered that are 100% not indigenous liberation movements. Do not go into my comments and argue that settler Taiwanese nationalism is an indigenous movement or that Zionism is an indigenous movement. You're wrong, and indigenous people are right, okay? Anyways, let's start. Is Catalonian independence an indigenous movement? This is one that's debated constantly in Catalan communist spaces. I personally believe that while Catalonian independence, similar to Basque and Andalusian independence, is a native separatist movement against a government that has repressed native Catalan people for a very long time, I don't consider it to be an indigenous movement because Catalonia, while still being under the control of the Spanish government, is an autonomous community. So they're not being dispossessed of their land currently or continually. They're native people of Catalonia for sure, but unlike native Hawaiians, they're not being forced off of their land by people in Madrid. And the Catalan government is certainly not led mostly by non-Catalan people like Hawaii's government is by non-indigenous Hawaiian people. Now, is the Canary Islands independence movement an indigenous movement? Again, we can disagree on this, but I would say in some cases it can be. Let me explain. The reason I say this is because Spanish settlers are in control of the Canary Islands today because they massacred the indigenous Guanche Amazigh people of the Canary Islands. But there is still a substantial population in the Canary Islands that descends from the indigenous people of these islands, and some nationalist revolutionary organizations in the Canary Islands are specifically pro-Amazigh and anti-colonial for this reason. Inekaren, for example, is a socialist, revolutionary, and anti-colonial organization which seeks both independence from Spain through national armed revolution as well as social and cultural revolution after independence that rejects the colonizer's identity and embraces their Amazigh one. So, if they, instead of the Popular Front of the Canary Islands, which is an independent but not anti-colonial Canarian nationalist organization, led an armed revolution movement against the Spanish occupation, then yeah, it would be an indigenous liberation movement in my eyes. Now, is Sephardic repatriation to Sepharad an indigenous movement? I will fight people over this, but I generally believe it should be considered one. The Spanish monarchy and state after the Reconquista did everything in their power to kick out Sephardic people from Spain, dispossessing them of their land and kicking them out of their homes and giving said homes to Christian Iberians and force them to convert to Catholicism and assimilate to Spanish Christian culture or get executed, which is ethnic cleansing. There's barely any Sephardic people left in Spain, and historically Sephardic cities and neighborhoods, especially historic Jewish quarters in Spanish cities, are devoid of Sephardic people. About 30% of Spain, and more specifically 50% of Andalusia, have Sephardic converso ancestry, and if you ever heard a Sephardic person speak Ladino, you realize they're just as Iberian and just as deserving to live in their ancestral lands as Spanish Christians. Judaism and Christianity arrived on the Iberian Peninsula at the same exact time, if Judaism didn't arrive even sooner. So there's nothing less native about Sephardic people compared to Christian Spaniards. If communist and anarchist organizations in Spain were to take the mantle of demanding Sephardic repatriation and fighting anti-Semitism in Spain away from the neoliberal government, who only allowed a 4-year window from 2015 to 2019 for Sephardic people to apply for repatriation, and then rejected or never responded to a large chunk of the 150,000 people who applied, if leftists were to take that mantle and actually put an emphasis on fighting anti-Semitism in Spain, I would consider that an indigenous liberation movement. But even if it wasn't an indigenous liberation movement, it is still, in my eyes, a very important movement. Is Pan-Africanism an indigenous movement? This is actually a really interesting question, but from what I know about Pan-Africanism, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because again, these are up for debate, I would say that it's not only a Black liberation and Black nationalist movement, but an indigenous African liberation movement. Pan-Africanism is a unification movement of all indigenous people to Africa, including the Black diaspora, who are also indigenous to Africa and whose ancestors were forcibly displaced from their home, enslaved, against colonialism and imperialism. I think that it might be a mix of indigenous movements, right? So sovereignty over African land into the hands of African people, as well as a repatriation movement. So I don't think it can be defined solely as an indigenous movement, because it's not just an indigenous movement. It's also a repatriation movement. It is also a Black liberation movement. Is Ukrainian... Sorry, I know it's not. Just there's been so much discourse online about this, and it's so stupid, and I'm so tired of it. Is Ukrainian nationalism an indigenous movement? Obviously not. Nothing about the ideology of Ukrainian nationalists is anywhere aligned to indigenous liberation. How do you explain this being a liberation movement if they step over or make other native people to their country who are marginalized the enemy? How do you make a white nationalist movement an indigenous movement when whiteness is stemmed in colonialism? Immediately add this to the list of things that are not debatable. It's the same thing for all Eastern European nationalist movements, Lithuanian, Estonian, Romanian, and to be frankly honest, the majority of European nationalist movements in general, the Spanish one, the Portuguese one, the British one, whatever. Not all are inherently white supremacist or anti-Semitic or anti-Romani or classist. For example, Irish nationalism and Basque nationalism may not be inherently left-wing, but they do have a competent reason as they want to be an independent nation. That's all, oppression by other European countries. But it's like, It's common sense that British nationalism is not an indigenous Anglo-Saxon movement to free the British people from the colonial control of the European Union who is dispossessing them from their land, and instead a fascist white supremacist scumbag club, and so is Ukrainian nationalism. I will laugh at your face if you say Ukrainian nationalism is an indigenous movement. In contrast, I believe that Irish reunification is an indigenous movement because Northern Irish people are under occupation of a non-native government with settlers having control over a lot of the land. I do not believe that Ukraine, which is a sovereign country, is being colonized. I don't care what you say. You can say Russia's doing anything. They are not colonizing Ukraine. This is not an indigenous movement. And if there's a Ukrainian that's going to comment, oh, you always say that we're Nazis, why we're not all anti-Semitic white supremacists, some of us we're starved to death, and blah, blah. Okay, if you're not white supremacists, anti-Semites, then stop acting like them. How about that? If you don't want Ukrainian nationalism to be associated with white supremacy, anti-Semitism, classism, fascism, maybe you should look into the problem of why there's fascists and neo-Nazis and Ukrainian nationalist movements. How about that? How about you stop blaming people for seeing Nazi symbols and being like, damn, those people are Nazis, and getting offended that people are pointing out that those people that are Ukrainian nationalists are Nazis, and instead, I don't know, address the fact that there's Nazis on your side instead of ignoring it and deflecting. You're honestly telling me in good faith that you are more upset that I'm saying, oh wow, there's Nazis in the Ukrainian nationalist movement, then you are upset that there's Ukrainian nationalists that are Nazis. That's what's bothering you? I don't know. If you don't want me to call them Nazis, maybe they should stop being Nazis. I don't know. Thank you for watching my video. Once again, here are the Indigenous creators I recommend. I also recommend that you watch this discussion about LandBack, which Luna Oy hosted, that includes a bunch of Indigenous comrades, and that you follow Anti-Conquista. They constantly talk about Indigenous movements in Latin America and how us in the imperial core can materially support them. Also, if you want the Filipino government to stop bombing Lumar people with the money that they receive from our taxes, tell your representatives to sign the Philippine Human Rights Act. And I, of course, encourage you to adopt BDS into your life and your diet. McDonald's is not worth supporting the apartheid settler colonial state of Israel. Also, their nuggets suck. If you want to support me making content, and if you want to give me suggestions about what content I should make next, or if you want to watch my content before everyone else, join my Patreon. And thank you to my patrons, JS, Nathan Gooch, Sully Iqbal, Frey, and Chris Guevara. Once again, thank you for listening to this little essay of mine about nativity, indigeneity, ethnicity, indigenous liberation, and settler colonialism, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or night, depending on where you're watching this. And remember, real hot girls read Frantz Fanon.
Fuck your life! Bing bong!